Hello, class. This is section 4.2 on the Old Kingdom. There are three main ideas for this section. Number one, life in the Old Kingdom was influenced by pharaohs, roles in society, and trade. Number two, religion shaped Egyptian life. And number three, the pyramids were built as huge tombs for Egyptian pharaohs. All right, so let's start with the first section, which discusses life in the Old Kingdom. The first term that we see in this section is the Old Kingdom, and the definition for that is it was a period from about 2700 to 2200 BC in Egyptian history that began shortly after Egypt was unified. So that's about 4,500 to 5,000 years ago. And so just think of it as one of the earliest kingdoms of ancient Egypt. And so in the Old Kingdom, there was a political system based on the pharaoh, who we have here in this picture, who was seen as both the king, but he was more than that. He was seen as a god as well. He was like a living god. And the pharaoh had control of everything, but also, if things went poorly, if things went bad in Egypt, he would be blamed for it. So, with the power came responsibility and blame. There were various social classes in the Old Kingdom, and you can see them here on this triangle, this pyramid, where you can see the pharaoh at the top, followed by government officials, nobles, and priests. Priests were high up because religion was such an important part of Egyptian society. Below that, you've got soldiers, scribes. Scribes were, not at the bottom because they had the power to write, and that afforded them power with those higher up people. Then you have merchants, right, who sold things, craftsmen, people who built stuff, and at the bottom you've got farmers and slaves. Farmers made up about 80% of society, which is a huge percentage, right? 80%. So in five out of five people in ancient Egypt, four of them were farmers. And when they weren't farming, they would also work on some of Pharaoh's projects, such as building the pyramids, building different monuments, that sort of thing. And the map on the right here shows some of the different areas that Egypt traded with. So they traded with Nubia, which you can see down in the very bottom of the map. It was a kingdom south of Egypt. And they also traded with Syria, which would be in the Middle East. You see in the map, the top right, Jerusalem. It'd be kind of in that direction. That's where you'd find Syria. The next section is on religion and Egyptian life. But before we get to that, we have a couple terms here. We've got the term nobles. So nobles are rich and powerful people. Okay, so like we saw in that previous slide, they're towards the top, right below the pharaoh. And we have Khufu. Khufu was an Egyptian pharaoh. He ruled during Egypt's Old Kingdom and is known for the many monuments built to honor him. So he came after Menes, who was in the previous section, but he was a pharaoh during that Old Kingdom, and they built a bunch of monuments and pyramids and stuff for him. So again, religion and Egyptian life. Egyptians worshipped many gods, which you can see many of them here, some images of them. The government made people worship the same gods, and they built temples to the gods. The term afterlife, it means life after death, right? So the Egyptians believed in an afterlife. They believed in some form of a life after death. The term elite means people of wealth and power, like those people, like those nobles I mentioned earlier. And here we have a picture of a mummy. Mummies are specially treated bodies wrapped in cloth for preservation. So they figured out how to kind of preserve the bodies, right, so they wouldn't decay. But before I do that. Let's talk about some other stuff here. So, the afterlife was a happy place in ancient Egyptian uh, thought. So, the term ka refers to the soul, which they believe remained with the body. Um, so that's why when they buried like the pharaoh and they buried nobles, they would bury them with items. They'd bury them with jewels. They'd bury them with sometimes even people, right? Right. To provide for them in their death, right? So they believed that there was a whole life after death, and so that's why they would would bury their elite with things. And like I mentioned before, bodies were preserved with a process called embalming. And embalming was only something that the rich could do, so mummification. And unfortunately for the poor, they would be buried in the sand. So the last section is on the pyramids. So pyramids are huge triangular tombs built by the Egyptians and other peoples. So a tomb is a place where after someone dies, they are buried. So essentially, these pyramids were just a fancy place for the pharaoh to be buried. You can see here on the right inside one of these pyramids. I believe that in this particular one, the pharaoh would have been in a sarcophagus on top of this giant pillar that you see. Um, so yeah, they were spectacular burial sites for the pharaohs. Here's some kind of a cool image that gives us some perspective. So you see the Eiffel Tower in France, the Great Pyramid of Giza. You can see how it compares in terms of height, and comparing to some of the things we are familiar with. The Great Pyramid of Giza is much larger than the Statue of Liberty. You can see it towers over it. It's also much wider than any of these other things. So the base is huge. Some facts on uh, one of these pyramids: 481 feet high, contained more than 2 million massive limestone blocks, and these blocks are taller than a person. So imagine 2 million of them, and 100,000 workers were needed to build these pyramids. Um, yeah, there were a burial chamber deep in the pyramid, so you could see that here that kind of shows that. And the reason they had the point at the top was it pointed to the sky because of their belief in the afterlife. Real quick, one more term here is engineering. Engineering is the application of scientific knowledge for practical purposes. So to build these pyramids would have required a pretty high level of engineering, right? Think of engineering as science, mathematics used to build stuff, right? So here we see some pictures of modern day engineering on the left, and what that would have looked like on the right. You could see people they would have drawn up plans, they would have used mathematics to figure things out, angles and stuff, and use all that to plan and use their labor force to build these pyramids. So the big idea for this section is that Egyptian government and religion were closely connected during the Old Kingdom. All right, thank you.